Back in 2020, storage space was scarce. I'd delete game footage after the review was made, and very few of the renders are left around to go into this video. I'd render high quality videos, but it was before I understood YouTube conversion, so here's what's left of the first Halloween, upgraded to 1440p. S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chernobyl is a first-person survival horror game set in a world where the Chernobyl reactor mysteriously exploded again in 2006, creating an area referred to as the Zone. Whilst it's debatably a horror game, I couldn't pass up the chance to talk about it. Atmosphere. The Zone itself is so hostile it's intimidating. The combat, being as nerve-wracking and brutal as it is, leaves you constantly on the lookout for bandits, weird anomalies and mutants. It's incredibly stressful, and every new area fills you with apprehension for what may lie in wait for you. The music also reinforces that feeling of loneliness that permeates through every aspect of the game. Horrifying wails and screams come from the wilderness with no identifiable source, which I found creepy and unsettling. The Zone is an immensely immersive place thanks to the AI system and the way the NPCs and enemies interact freely. It feels like a living, breathing world, which makes each encounter unique. But thanks to the anomalies and strange mutant behavior, it also feels like a mysterious foreign land that's so similar to something you know, but the Zone's nature adheres to a different set of rules, which in itself is disconcerting. When you slip underground, the atmosphere changes radically and you're left with a strong feeling of isolation and dread as you creep around in the dark, surrounded by frighteningly fast and deadly monsters. The atmosphere reminds you that you're alone and your continued survival is uncertain. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. I find this game terrifying no matter how many times I play it. The combat relies on near-twitch reactions, and the game includes mechanics like your gun jamming, which in life and death combat situations induces panic like no other. Considering how fast you can be killed, hearing your gun click is usually the last thing you'll hear before seeing the game over screen. The monsters in the game usually have a frighteningly high pool of health, which makes killing them before they kill you all the more difficult. Enemies like the poltergeist can lift things off the floor, which I've always found unsettling, but no matter how many times I see it, I'm never ready for when the object comes hurtling towards me. Whilst there are a lot of neat scripted sequences, the most terrifying ones aren't planned. They happen naturally, during combat or when exploring, allowing you to never let your guard down. Gunfire coming out of the darkness catches you by surprise every time it happens, and before you know what's happened, you've usually died. It's terrifying. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack is a rich selection of ambient pieces that capture the hostility and abandonment of the Zone perfectly, which is occasionally complemented by the screaming of monsters that echoes from the distance. Hearing unearthly moaning reverberating across the plains made me stop and turn my head in the direction of the sound and wonder what was making it so many times. The same can be said for a lot of the underground areas, where you can hear the metallic swinging of door hinges and the clanging of metal, but it's rare to find the source of the sound. The death howls of enemy soldiers and monsters are disturbing, and the voices of the zombies that appear later in the game I find really creepy. Being set in Ukraine, there's also the language barrier that prevents you from knowing what enemy soldiers are saying or what they're planning. Overall, it's a fantastic selection of sound and music that perfectly complement the atmosphere. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's a lot of dead bodies and some of them are pretty gnarly, but there's not a great deal of gore. Shooting enemies leaves blood splatters on the walls behind them, but that's about it. It's realistic, and that's what the game strives for. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. From my perspective, the story starts out fantastically with you being saved from a death truck and being brought back alive to a small camp where your PDA tells you to kill a man called S.T.A.L.K.E.R. But it gets sort of confusing from there on out. It's hard to tell sometimes why you're doing what you're doing, and whilst the missions were interesting for the most part, it was hard to see the connecting lines between them and how you came to be at the Chernobyl reactor other than maybe your dreams hinting to it. It's not like there's not a story here, it's just not easy to understand it. Making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. A lot of fans agree that mods enhance the experience of the game and can make Shadow of Chernobyl even more frightening, but the vanilla game is stressful enough as it is. It's one of my favourite games and I can't deny how often it frightens me. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was scared out of my mind in the X-18 lab, I certainly did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
Reaching your goal, the more danger you are in. Someone seeks to keep you here with us forever. One who will do anything to keep you from leaving the asylum.
Why? Who conspires against me?
I can only say that if you leave, it will mean this person's downfall. But your time is short. Waste not fruitless questions on me. The air grows thick with frost, and soon I must return to my eternal slumber.
Sanitarium is a point-and-click horror adventure game following Max, a patient trapped in a sanitarium who goes on a journey of rediscovery to try and remember who he is. Atmosphere. It's rare that age affects a game in a positive way, but Sanitarium's unique graphics and design have only made it creepier with time. The early 3D rendering makes things look realistic enough to be disturbing, but cartoonish enough to still seem weird. But weird is an excellent way to describe the game. Weird are its themes and feelings, with odd things happening around you all the time, be it dialogue from the tormented people you talk to, or situations that don't make any sense. It jumps from chapter to chapter like going in and out of dreams, where you explore carnival as a little girl or an alien hive as a four-armed cyclops before bringing you back to the sanitarium. But it's the disturbing subjects that the game covers that give it a feeling of unearthly despair, a certain hopelessness and futility that always left me feeling sorry for Max for having to endure the scenes the game forces you through together. They describe the game as a journey through one man's consciousness, and it feels just like that, a disjointed dream. That's 1 Harry Mason. Scares. I wouldn't say the game is scary in any other way other than conceptually. There are no jump scares or anything to frighten you, it's mostly just the idea of what's going on. The topics covered in the game are difficult, themes of mutation, genetic experiments, insanity, spirituality and the paranormal and supernatural, and they all blend together. It's very weird, disturbing stuff, but it won't scare you out of your seat, just make you uncomfortable sitting in it. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. Some incredibly creepy and melancholic melodies play throughout the game. My favourite sections included the morgue and the town of children. Soft synthesized pieces and sinister pianos and menacing organ music provide an excellent backing for the game's themes. It all fits very well. The sound effects are low quality, but this oddly works in its favour in a way I can't describe. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There's a lot of death, dismembered bodies, blood, corpses and mutilated remains, and thanks to the way it's drawn, it's incredibly disturbing to look at. I'd go as far as to say the gore in this game is more harrowing than most of the other games I've played this Halloween. It's very creepy. That's 3 Harry Masons.
What's happening? Where am I?
Story. Without spoiling anything, the main character awakens in a sanitarium after a car crash and can't remember who he is, but he knows he's sane and must escape. The story takes on a lot of disturbing twists and makes the journey of rediscovery all that more brilliant. The chapter jumps and character changes all work to convey different aspects of the main character. It plays with the emotions of the player as well, providing characters in horrible situations who cannot be saved. And whilst a lot of the game is messed up, it's that weirdness that keeps the game interesting. It's some of the best storytelling I've ever experienced in a horror game, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Even the puzzles are weird and interesting in this game. I was really surprised just how well put together it is. When a game gets more creepy as time goes on, that's when you know you're into something special. Sanitarium is a great game. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I'll never forget the things I saw in this game, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
I can't help but think it's more than a coincidence that strange happenings have increased since I've been back from the war. I want to get to the bottom of this, but I'm just too weak to investigate it myself. I'm relying on you to step in for me.
Of course, Jeremiah. The only reason I risk coming back here is to assist you however I can.
My thanks to you, Patrick.
What the hell is that?
Sounds like it came from downstairs.
I'll check it out. Lock the door behind me.
Clive Barker's Undying is a horror first-person shooter produced by horror writer Clive Barker. It follows the story of Patrick Galloway, who was summoned to help a man deal with his supernaturally inclined family. Atmosphere. The atmosphere is very fitting of a gothic horror game, with ghosts giggling and flying about and things going bump in the night, thunderstorms and big mansions to explore. There's a mild air of mystery and suspense, but it never seems to go any deeper than that. It doesn't really do anything interesting with the lighting or sound design, and most of the house is just kind of empty. The overall lack of music that plays throughout the game feels like a missed opportunity, and the silence that replaces it doesn't feel eerie. The combat takes up a large portion of the game, and even when I was left alone to explore, I didn't feel much of anything. So, no Harry Masons. Scares. Whilst the game does surprise the player by spawning enemies in random locations to catch you off guard, it's not particularly frightening. The combat is really enjoyable, but it's not scary. The live burial cutscene is the only part of the game that's memorable because it's really disturbingly done, to the point where it stands out as the only seriously sinister part of the game. The creepy corpse of the family's mother singing with a withered voice was disturbing too, but there's nothing else that comes to mind. The boss fights were really cool, but again, not frightening. One of the things that did work for me was hearing the voice of someone chanting behind a locked door when you walk past it, which was kind of creepy, and the blowing of curtains always left me feeling like something was going to jump out, but nothing ever did. Whilst the game throws a lot of paranormal things at you, most of it failed to get anything out of me. Still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack has some nice pieces, but it's mostly incidental music which only comes in when something happens, which isn't very often. The game's ambiance consists of low rumbles and the blowing of wind, which does a bit to enhance the mood. The sound effects are all pretty decent for the time, but it's only really serviceable stuff. There's not a lot on offer here besides the mysterious voices that encourage you to use the scry ability, which can be kind of spooky. The voice acting is pretty good, but the dialogue and some of the delivery is sort of cheesy. Overall, though, it's serviceable stuff. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. Thanks to the age of the Unreal Engine that the game uses, the bodies are incredibly gnarly. Faces look like they've been chewed off or dipped in acid, and it's kind of shocking to just see how creepy some of this makes them look. But unfortunately, during combat, the gore that takes place is a bit silly, with heads being sliced off left, right, and center, and bright colored blood pouring out from the wound. To the point where decapitating people becomes a bit mundane. If you stop taking the game too seriously, then it starts being a lot more fun. Seeing Patrick slap the dismembered head of a family member before setting it on fire and throwing it off a cliff is pretty badass. That's two Harry Masons.
How dare you! I will gnash your heart between my teeth and drink deeply! The ritual will be complete! The king will arise and the very world will tremble! The family is to be reunited!
You were saying?
Story. Occultist Patrick Galloway returns to the house of a man who saved his life to investigate mysterious goings-on. When he arrives, he finds him in an ongoing feud with his supernatural family. The story is engaging enough while you're being fed it. There's diary entries and flashbacks that are kind of interesting, but you're mostly left to get on with the gameplay, and the story only crops up every now and then. I find certain elements of it kind of cliche, with a lot of stereotypes, like an old lighthouse keeper whose son died and the concept of a supernatural family feud. It's all very typical horror stuff, and some of it even got me chuckling. The lighthouse keeper's son's gravestone only has his first name on it. There's a plot twist near the end, but it feels a bit shoehorned in to make the final boss, which wasn't very satisfying. For a horror writer like Clive Barker to be part of this, I was expecting something more substantial than I got. The guy wrote Hellraiser, but I guess things don't always work out the way we plan, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the gothic horror isn't my thing, and I found a lot of what happened in the game to be either silly or tame, it's an enjoyable game to play. The combat is a hell of a lot of fun, and if you don't take it seriously, you'll have a good time until the latter half. It does feel like most of the love went into the first 3 hours, and the rest of it was padded out just a little too much. Ultimately, it's a solid first-person shooter with some mildly spooky horror elements and lots of decapitations. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was shocked by the corpses, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
That did it.
Stand by with that morphine. 4 megs.
Where are we at, Dr. York?
It's tachycardic. We need to stabilize before progressing.
No time.
He's unstable. Progressing now would be a mistake. You're putting... Set to 300.
You'll feel a little pinch. Now.
F.E.A.R. 2 Project Origin is a first-person action horror game and sequel to the original F.E.A.R. It follows the story of Sergeant Beckett and his team as they continue the battle against Ulmer. Atmosphere. The game's atmosphere is very on and off, like the original F.E.A.R. The combat will trail off and you'll find yourself in a designated spooky mode. There's only a light feeling of isolation and maybe the tension in places like the hospital, but the game is very combat focused, even in comparison to its predecessor. There are some very creepy sections when you first explore the ruins of the town, but once the streets are filled with gunfire, the atmosphere is kinda gone. The environmental lighting isn't as dark or foreboding, you're constantly in contact with your squad mates, and radio chatter disarms whatever spooky things are happening around you. Also, it's very easy to find your way to the next objective, and the maze-like layout of the various facilities of the first game are streamlined here, so you're through and out very quickly. Overall, I think the heavier focus on the combat drains whatever atmosphere there is. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. Ulmer, the creepy ghost girl of the original game, has aged into a young adult and there's a certain level of creepiness lost there. She's more aggressive in this, but it doesn't feel like a vengeful, irrational child with unlimited power anymore. The number of times you push Ulmer back in this game makes her seem less threatening. They also decided to make her naked in this and then twist her appearance between healthy and malnourished in an attempt to gross out the player, which is just disturbing. However, one of my favourite things the game introduced was the ghosts, which have some very cool effects and can charge at you at top speed, which can be pretty frightening if you aren't ready. What keeps the game going is the random spooky set pieces, but I found you had to go out of your way to find them, and in some cases I was there and still missed them. The original game did a much better job at drawing your attention and catching you by surprise. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack wasn't as strange and hypnotic as the original game. Some tense pieces played, nothing that grabbed my attention or lended to the atmosphere. Most of the sound effects were okay, the sound design was neither standout, fantastic, nor terrible. Everything just felt competent. The voice acting was pretty fantastic, even if some of it kind of betrayed the tone of the game. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. The gore in this game was very impressive. Intricate diagrams were drawn in blood, disintegrated skeletons were tinged red, and piles of organic material were all that was left of some poor souls. Shooting enemies produced blood clouds with each bullet's impact, and in slow motion you could see a head explode and leave eyeballs and body parts. Whilst this stuff was not particularly frightening, the combat was very gory and very cool. That's two Harry Masons. Story. The story followed Sergeant Beckett as he made contact with one of the surviving members of the Armicam team, the company responsible for the replica soldiers you battle throughout the game, then eventually turned his gaze upon Ulmer. It's a continuation of the original game, but doesn't have as many twists. They also dropped tons of intel items, but made a lot of them totally irrelevant or unintelligible. They ditched the voice-acted answering machine messages in favour of walls of text, which slowed down the gameplay and made collecting and reading them a total chore, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. F.E.A.R. 2 is an exceedingly fun game, but it's not a great horror game. Slow motion, sniping people and kicking super soldiers is a barrel of fun, just like the original, so if you like that, this game is for you. But don't come to this to expect anything other than some gory shootouts and the occasional spook. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, so if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was a little freaked out by gross naked Ulmer, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from a computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bombs in the middle of the night. Peace.
met Anne first, waiting for the bus. Normally, I avoid talking to just about anybody, but she struck up the conversation. She was so pleasant, so confident. She smiled at me as if she had known me as a kid, and we were just catching up after all these years. She told me she could tell I had a hole in my life. She knew what that was like, she said. She had also had a hole, but it was gone now. I asked her what she was selling, and she laughed and said nothing, nothing at all, that what she had to offer was free for anyone who wanted it bad enough. I asked her what had helped her. She just said, James.
Sagebrush is a story-based exploration game where you discover the dark past of the Black Sage Ranch. Atmosphere. One of the most impressive things the game does is explain right at the start that you're exploring the site of a mass suicide, which sets the tone immediately. Even if nothing else happens during the game, you know something terrible happened here, which makes a lot of the exploring ominous, with various mundane things taking on a new light in the wake of previous events. Exploring totally abandoned communal areas is incredibly eerie, and I got the feeling of being somewhere I shouldn't be. But as the story progressed and more things were revealed, the atmosphere turned to dread as I unlocked more areas expecting to find something horrific. It's a very sad game that tells a very uncomfortable story. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There aren't any enemies, and besides creaky floorboards and the lights flickering on and off during my time in the mine, there wasn't anything frightening that really took place. It's more along the lines of a campfire tale brought disturbingly to life than a traditional scarefest. The one thing that'll stick with you throughout the game is the realization that it's all based on real events and could actually take place. The later parts of it are deeply unsettling and extremely unpleasant. There aren't any scares, but the horror hangs in the air around you. That's still one Harry Mason.
I often helped Viola in the schoolhouse. I enjoyed working with the children. We taught them reading, writing, scripture. Viola was one of the most faithful among us. If Anne was like the mother of the flock, Viola was the older sister. I remember one lecture she gave the children on the nature of hell that was so vivid, so unflinching, it had the kids in tears. I told her she was scaring them, and she said, "Good, they should be scared."
Sound design. The sound design is a bit disappointing. It does feature directional audio, but the implementation is a bit poor on the PlayStation 4. Sounds can be heard long after you've left the area, and it's hard to tell where they're coming from. The music is moody and fits the depressing tone of the game, but it's just not there enough. There were occasions where I felt it should have come in when it didn't. The voice acting was very good for the most part, but some of the voice actors seemed like the same two people, even though that wasn't the case, which was confusing. That's still one Harry Mason. Gore. There are a few bloodstains, but thanks to the visual style of the game, they aren't much to look at. Gore is brought to life in harrowing diary entries explaining how punishment was dealt with on the ranch, which filled in the gaps. There's more mentions of all sorts of torture and willing self-mutilation than there is anything to see. The later parts of the story get more intense, but there's really only what's mentioned in the diary entries and audio tapes. Despite not being visual, the gore is present, even if the game paints it in your mind. That's two Harry Masons. Story. Sagebrush sends you to the Black Sage Ranch to uncover its past. It tells you right at the start that it was the scene of a mass suicide, and that hangs over the game as you recall the events that lead up to it. It's an excellently told story with some really disturbing moments. The audio tapes and diary entries are absolutely worth reading, and each new one revealed more creepy events and tales of depravity. The mindset of the cult is portrayed well, and it's not an easy story to stomach. It handles a lot of difficult themes. The final score, 3 out of 5 Harry Masons.
Don't be afraid. There's no need to be afraid. We must go through the flames, but the flames will not hurt us. Not our true selves, our spiritual selves.
Whilst the game only lasts about an hour, Sagebrush's story is one worth telling, dragging you into the events of the mass suicide and beyond. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that while some of the story was upsetting, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Moons of Madness is a Lovecraft-inspired first-person horror game where you play as Shane Newhart as he unravels mysterious events on planet Mars. Atmosphere. At the very start of the game, it layers on this great feeling of tension and dread as you explore the darkened corridors of the Mars base, but as soon as the intro section is over, the atmosphere disappears and never really seems to come back. There's long periods of nothing whilst you do chores or boring puzzles, and the vague feeling of isolation and mystery is ever present as you wait for something to happen. At every chance, the game drops the player into dark environments, but due to the lack of threat, it's a bit ineffectual. It also pulls a lot of tired tropes that are typical of a video game portrayal of madness, like putting common things in an uncommon place, or transporting the character into their past, which pulled me out of the experience. Even as the game radically changed the environment, or even when it reached its climax, there's just a general lack of atmosphere that's extremely disappointing. No Harry Masons. Scares. The game relies heavily on the sporadic inclusion of jump scares, and whilst a lot of them are effective due to the long periods of nothing that come between them, that's about all it delivers. The enemies of the early game move so slowly they're practically harmless, and the robots, whilst killing you in 2 hits, are only frightening on your first encounter with them. After that, it's just annoying. The game's signature monster only appears a few times, and it was very, very easy to escape it. Even if the game relied solely on jump scares, the space between them is just too great to allow any player to stay on edge. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. There's a lot of silence and none of it is eerie. All that fills the gaps is the low electric hum of the bass or the blowing winds of Mars. The soundtrack is an amalgamation of forgettable ambient moods that adds a bit of suspense to the game. On the other hand, sound effects are all really good, some of them ticking many sci-fi boxes in my head. The voice acting was pretty decent, but there were often parts where Shane would scream and yell in reaction to seeing something that I personally didn't find frightening, and that disconnect between me and my character made me wish for a silent protagonist. That's still no Harry Masons.
Oh shit! Come on! Come on! Come on, open! Let's go, let's go, let's go! Come on! Come on! Open, open, open! Come on! Shit!
Gore. There's a few splatters of blood in places and 1 or 2 corpses to be found, but they don't really give much of a reaction. The plant hybrids were kinda gross, but that's about it. That's still no Harry Masons. Story. After waking from a nightmare, engineer Shane Newhart performs repairs on the base before discovering a deadly plant is running loose in the hydroponics bay. The story picks up a lot of ideas and doesn't really run with any of them. There's plenty of things that could have made for an interesting development if more time and effort was put into them, but instead the plot thickens and then weakens again quite quickly, and a lot of things felt like they were just never resolved. A lot of the Lovecraftian elements were really forced in, and it leaves the game feeling like an amalgamation of unfinished ideas, making the final score 0 out of 5 Harry Masons. It's sad and disappointing that a game with so much promise failed to deliver on anything. It doesn't really tick any of the boxes, and this is one of the least interesting horror games I've ever played. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games. If you don't share his opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I can't wait to play something else, I do not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer. I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem is a third-person survival horror game following different characters in a battle against evil that spans nearly 2,000 years. Atmosphere. There's a strong feeling of mysticism when you explore the temples and ancient structures, like you're playing with things you don't understand, plus the ever-present looming threat of an ancient and terrifying gods can leave you feeling like you're insignificant to stop the forces at work. Really though, it's the lighting and soundtrack that do most of the heavy lifting. Some fantastic moody lighting and the musical pieces that play do wonders to evoke feelings of dread and despair. The sanity meter is of course the star of the show. When it starts getting low, the camera tilts to one side and voices whisper your character's name, blood drips down the walls, and things start moving on their own. Some of it is really creepy stuff, but the best thing about it is that it all mounts up rather than being a constant thing. It happens as a response to your actions, and unless you do something about it, it only increases, becoming more strange and severe as time goes on.
I tried.
That's one Harry Mason.
They wouldn't listen to me. Damn their eyes! They didn't believe me. Strange, righteous, the world in peril from unseen foes. The darkness. Instead they jeered and threw me into this forsaken place. A place of empty souls and fevered thoughts, reeking of fetor and decay, thinking me mad with delirium. The fools cast away their hopes of salvation by locking me in this damned asylum. May the rats eat your eyes! I am now lost to your cause! The darkness comes! It will damn us all!
Scares. Whilst it could be said that it relies on the same thing the main Resident Evil frightening with intense but less life-threatening combat, it's really the sanity effects that doubtlessly steal the show, tricking players into thinking their TV has changed channel, their save games are being deleted, or even just blowing off a character's head randomly. Some of these are more effective than others. I found some of the smaller ones more effective in freaking me out or making me jump, with the simplest one being a candle sparking and producing a noise that often startled me. It's safe to say that some of these are less effective in the modern age, with very few people still playing these on televisions that have user interfaces like the ones in the sanity effects, but it's still weird to see. Besides this though, there really isn't anything else. The combat isn't frightening, and as you gain knowledge of more spells, it becomes easier as the game goes on. The problem is, the game can scare you, but the more you know of the sanity effects, the less frightening the game becomes, and most of what you'll experience is down to what the game decides to spring on you anyway. Throughout my entire playthrough, I didn't capture the one where it deletes my save game, which is arguably the most frightening one. At the end of the day, it's an innovator of unique scares, but I can't give it the point, as your mileage may vary. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. In my opinion, Eternal Darkness is one of the most memorable soundtracks in any horror game ever, with heady rhythms and heavy chanting being the basis for the tracks that provide both a feeling of purpose and hopelessness, to chilly synth and gurgling effects that give some of the tracks a feeling of absolute despair. The sound effects are all incredible, with a certain B-movie charm to the more traditional ones like the magic barriers and weapon effects to the simply awesome sound of spell incantations and monster roars. The unique sanity effects that take advantage of the sound design are the best, with ghostly voices that speak out the character's name as you travel the levels. The voice acting is fantastic, but if you look at the people cast in it, it's no wonder it's so good. Overall, the sound design is some of the best that horror games have to offer. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. In combat, blood spurts out of nearly every enemy, and dismemberment, while slightly cartoonish, is still very much a thing. It's gory, but in a brightly coloured way. During the cutscenes, there's some torn open bodies, and watching Anthony slowly turn into a zombie was pretty gnarly. While some may say the way it's presented disarms it a bit, it's hard to say it's not there, and it does fit in with the art style of the game. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. Following the grisly murder of her grandfather, Alex Roivas returns to her family home and uncovers the Tome of Eternal Darkness tucked away in a secret room in her grandfather's mansion. What follows is a journey as it sees 12 characters throughout history battle the impending darkness that plans to enslave humanity. The story is frankly awesome in both scope and concept. It executes it really well, with each character having a unique part to play, and seeing it all interconnect itself so well is really admirable. It's got lots of dark twists and really keeps the player engaged throughout the game, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Eternal Darkness is a great game, and whilst certain elements of it have been spoiled by both time and the internet, it's still a really enjoyable experience. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games, so if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was embarrassed to be scared of candles, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Welcome to Hanwell is a first-person open-world horror game where you explore the village of Hanwell, a place where mysterious anomalies run rampant and everyone has gone missing. Atmosphere. My favourite thing about the game is that it just starts explaining nothing and lets you get on with exploring, providing you only an inventory screen that lists things to collect. It sets a tone of mystery. To begin with, you really don't know where you are or what's happening. The first thing you'll likely encounter is a recorder that says a dangerous creature is on the loose. It put me on edge from the very start, and it didn't let up throughout the gameplay. When you get to the village of Hanwell, there's an eerie silence. The street is littered with abandoned cars and boarded up houses, and it's just very lonely. Inside the homes and buildings, however, the atmosphere changes dramatically. Nearly every location gives off a different vibe, be it rancid decay, abandonment, or unsettling normality. It's all portrayed through frankly incredible lighting and music, with some areas being so dark you can't see it all. There's also a day and night cycle in the open world, but it doesn't feel like anything really changes, it's just darker at night. No matter what building I went into, there was a constant feeling of apprehension. Because of the changing nature of the combat and the scripted events, no area felt safe. It felt like anything could happen, and it was extremely intense. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The scripted events in this game are incredible, ranging from the totally bewildering to the completely terrifying. Its lack of pattern stops you from becoming desensitized to it. These are some of the coolest events I've ever seen, from a giant eyeball rolling past a doorway to a group of figures locking me in a prison shower that filled up with blood. It causes genuine fear because you have no idea what's going on or how you're meant to survive it. The music ramps up to a dizzying high and only intensifies the panic, but it also sometimes gets really intense for no reason whatsoever, which accidentally caused me to start worrying that something was going to happen. The regular combat in itself is pretty frightening. It's intense, with enemies that can teleport or hit you rapidly as the anomaly siren blares in the distance, but it's also quite clunky, with it feeling more like flailing around randomly. Every encounter can kill you, and with how glitchy it can be, it does sometimes feel a bit cheap. Then there's the darkness clouds, which attack you and leave you practically blind apart from the sonar ability to reveal where you're going, which looks really cool. It's a nice feature, but it wasn't really used enough. It's also a shame there's only really 4 or so enemy types which you can enter combat with. There's also a few creepy encounters of things lurking in the distance or just out of player reach, which I found very unsettling. Overall, Welcome to Hanwell is a uniquely frightening game that I really enjoyed. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack ranges from creepy chimes to stress-inducing string sections. Some of it is vaguely reminiscent of Silent Hill soundtracks, but it's not as weird. Most of what is here is really emotive and frightening stuff. Between these is the eerie silence that hangs over Hanwell. The sound effects are interesting, but there's some sound environment problems that cause certain collectibles to be so loud you can hear them through 2 or 3 floors of a house. The voices that play over the village-wide tannoy are sometimes difficult to understand. Some things are too loud, and occasionally music will start with no real indicator of what's caused it, and it won't stop until you've entered a building or quit out of the game. The voice acting on the recordings was decent, with some characters sounding more convincing than others, but the standout for me was the one left in the church, which contained the most blood-curdling scream I think I've ever heard.
I am sorry, child, but you have been chosen. Only the will of God Almighty can rid the world of the horrors within. He has spoken to me. I am the messenger. And you, my dear, you are the vessel.
There's a radio to warn you of anomalies like there is in Silent Hill, but the benefit of playing the PlayStation 4 version is that the sounds come out of the controller, which I always find cool. There's a few technical problems holding back a really interesting experience here, but if you can get over these, it's really very good. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Thanks to the lighting and the impressive graphics, the blood looks really good, and there's lots of it. There's a few mangled bodies, and that's really about it. It's shocking when you see it, and it doesn't turn up too often, which is good. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The story of the game is told in a few extremely brief character interactions and through phone messages and recordings. It's this lack of information that makes Hanwell such a cool and mysterious place to explore, but the problem I find is I never really found out why Hanwell was like it was. Anomalies had taken over the place with enemies spawning in randomly, but I never found anything to explain it besides implied research. The problem with telling a game through voice recordings spread throughout the map is they're easy to miss and some of them are easy to forget. I finished the game not really understanding what happened, certain characters' importance wasn't made clear to me, and it's entirely possible I missed an important voice recording right at the start. If I can do it, anybody can. Making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game is an intriguing and horrifying experience, and the first open-world horror game I've played that I say works really well. It's a shame the story wasn't easier to encounter. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was totally afraid of the anomaly siren, I did not scream like a banshee or on the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Fingerbones is a short psychological horror game about a father and his daughter trapped in a bunker after the apocalypse. Atmosphere. From the very start of the game, there's a thick feeling of dread that continues to grow as the game goes on, with each note you find ramping up the intensity. Even after playing it a few times, I still think I'm going to see someone looming in the distance, but no one ever appears. It's a very sad and depressing game. An overwhelming sense of despair hangs in the air the entire time you play. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The real scares of this game come from reading the diary entries. The atmosphere and sound design lead you to believe that something bad is going to happen, and each diary entry continues to paint an increasingly disturbing image in your mind of what happened. There's a few sudden loud noises to put you on edge, and childlike screams that echo throughout the cold stone rooms are more harrowing with the diary entries giving them context. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. There's a soft melancholic synthesizer tune playing that gets more overbearingly sad as the game progresses. The use of reverb leaves the environment feeling very cold and empty, but the standout is the screams and cries, which sound very sorrowful. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's a few splatters of blood that once given context leave nothing to the imagination. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. Whilst it'd be easy to simply explain the 5 or so minute experience this game offers, it would ruin it completely. The subject matter of the game is deeply disturbing and focuses around morals and how they can be rejected in the case of something like an apocalypse. The main character who writes the diary entries is depicted as a very cold and uncaring individual, and reading the notes laying around is extremely unsettling, not only because what they say, but the realization that this could, and maybe has, realistically happened. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. For the extremely short experience the game offers, it really packs a punch. The subject matter is very delicate, and I suggest anyone who goes into this reads the description on the Steam store before downloading it. It is of course free though. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was filled with dread the entire time, I did not scream like a banshee or enter the computer. I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Palmyra Orphanage is a first-person horror game where you explore the eponymous orphanage to find out what happened to your brother. Atmosphere. The game's darkness and extremely limiting light source makes stumbling around in the pitch-black rooms completely nerve-wracking. For some areas you can't see anything until it's right in front of you. There's a lot of tension in waiting to see what's going to jump out of the darkness. There's an eerie quietness over most of the game that only lays on the apprehension as you explore the derelict-looking buildings. Reading notes and seeing the level of abandonment of child's played areas, upturned cots and stories of how the place fell into disuse are fairly depressing too. Overall, the atmosphere is a solid base. It's not overwhelming, but keeps the player on their toes. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There's a lot of jump scares that have been used to death by this point, with things flashing in front of you and sudden loud noises to startle you. There's a few pseudo-psychological effects like layers of fear-style static cuts that move your position or rearrange the environment around you. The main enemy of the game appears too infrequently and they aren't that threatening. Whilst these things are no doubt effective in startling the player, it's a very lazy way of making a horror game that I've seen way too often at this point. There are a few genuinely frightening moments that don't feel overused or cheap, but sadly they are vastly outnumbered. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The soundtrack was a series of very understated metallic ambient tones that laid low in the background, allowing the player to soak up the eerie quietness of the game, which was really nice. The sound effects were pretty realistic, but they weren't really anything special. There was some kind of problem with the directional audio that left me stumped in places. You could hear noises in the distance, but it was extremely difficult to pinpoint where it was, or in what direction the enemy was approaching you from, which may have actually made the game more frightening, so I have to approve. That's two Harry Masons. Gore. There was a lot of blood, with the walls being splattered in it, blood trails leading off to specific areas, blood filling the swimming pools and pouring out of taps. It felt pretty excessive, and even if it was there to symbolize parts of the story, the sheer amount of it was kind of needless and out of place. That's still two Harry Masons. Story. Returning to your childhood orphanage to find out what happened to your brother leads you to discover disturbing things about what happened at the orphanage. With the time period set after the demise of the Soviet Union and Russia, is an extremely bleak and depraved tale of people being forced to make horrific choices. The story is mostly told through diary entries in specific rooms to give things context, but they make sure you understand the story by weirdly retelling the whole thing in the last 10 minutes of the game, and provide you a multiple choice ending. The retelling felt tacked on and needless, but the overall story itself is still pretty interesting, making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. For an hour or so of gameplay, it's extremely well made, if not a little bit underwhelming. Visually it's fantastic, but doesn't provide anything deeper than a few jump scares in a series of dark rooms. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I cursed the darkness, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Five Nights at Freddy's is a point-and-click micromanagement horror game where you play as the night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, home to murderous animatronic robots. Atmosphere. There's a tremendous amount of tension and fear that comes with trying to locate all of the robots and keep one step ahead of the game. With them all moving around randomly, it becomes challenging to make sure that you're aware of where they are and that you're protected from them. The game makes you feel helpless, incredibly vulnerable, and watching the power reserve slowly fall induces panic since illogically the doors require power to stay locked. It provides you with a lot of hard choices. Either you try and make sure you know where they are and waste precious power on the camera feed, or you don't and sit there worrying. Overall, it's a very stressful game. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. In my opinion, this is a classic example of what you don't see is scarier than what you do. Whilst there's no denying that the jump scare that you get when you die is startling, the true fear is losing track of a robot and realizing it's too late for you. It's a roller coaster ride that either results in you staving off death for another night or succumbing to the inevitable. That's two Harry Masons. Sound design. There's a very light, haunting ambient track that plays in the background and some creepy party music and chimes, which is effective at setting the mood. There's a nice amount of ambiance, the fan blowing, the phone ringing, and occasionally the sound of what is either footsteps or something banging against the wall. The rest of the sound effects are really loud and designed to startle. The voice acting of the single guy who phones in is a bit too nonchalant considering the things he says about being forced inside an animatronic suit and cut to shreds, but it is a fun game for headphone users who can pick out little things that may give a clue to the whereabouts of the robots, which contributes quite well to the atmosphere whether it helps you or not. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's not really any, and it's a bit of a shame. I feel like it could have been used to great effect to drive home the point of how harrowing your end could be. That's still 3 Harry Masons. Story. The story reminds me of the kind of thing you'd read in a creepypasta, with a tale of animatronics that come alive after hours and want to stuff you in a robot suit because they think you're walking around without your outfit on. The story and some of the gameplay elements require you to let a lot of obvious things go, and they're clearly not meant to be thought about too much, or you'd realize the place would be shut down if the animatronics were killing people, and that it shouldn't cost power to keep a door shut. Personally, I find the story kind of silly, and if the game itself wasn't so good at what it set out to do, I'd not be able to take it seriously at all. While some people may find the story creepy, it doesn't really do anything for me, making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Despite my opinions on the game, it's still a frightening experience that inflicts dread and fear effortlessly and makes you feel truly helpless. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I loathed those robots, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Koudelka is a turn-based gothic horror RPG where you play as the eponymous Koudelka as she and her companions uncover the dark past of a cursed monastery. Atmosphere. The opening cutscene sets a mood instantly with Koudelka on a horse on a misty hillside with some hauntingly beautiful singing backing it up. However, whilst exploring the monastery, there's an eerie lack of music and the only ambient sound is a low rumble. The environments are all pre-rendered backdrops. Some of them are very ornate, but they all feel cold and empty, disused for many years. It's similar to Resident Evil, with some parts of the mansion looking visually comparable to environments seen in that game, but instead of the B-movie charm, there's a more genuine eeriness in exploring the monastery. They've put in a lot more detail in this, and along with some great lighting, it's very moody. On the darker side, there are bodies piled up in certain rooms, bones and remains are left abandoned in the hallways, and the chunky PlayStation graphics makes them look really creepy. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There's not really anything scary, but the enemy designs are all weird and creepy, and the PlayStation 1 graphics again make their appearance even weirder. These are some of my favourite creepy enemies in any game ever. The animation on them as well makes some of their movements unnatural looking. The spells enemies cast have weird sound effects, and it never states what a move is called, so you don't really know what it's going to do to you, which can be kind of worrying. The bosses are pretty unsettling, with some of them resembling Silent Hill enemies, and they are sometimes horrifyingly powerful, ripping your team to bits in no time at all. But I wouldn't say it's scary. The combat isn't frightening, and sometimes it's a bit repetitive, so it never really shocks the player. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The battle music is oddly fitting for the time the game is set in, as is the boss music. There's some beautiful, grandiose string sections that swell during the cutscenes, and equally there's some haunting pieces that play over them too. It creates some very emotional scenes. For a PlayStation 1 game, the voice acting and character animations are pretty amazing. There's a thick reverb that makes every footstep reverberate and really gives you a strong sense of the environment you're in. I love the sound of all the magic powers being used, and a lot of it sounds really haunting. That's two Harry Masons. Gore. There's only one or two parts of the game where blood is seen, and it's quite jarring, turning the tone quickly. It comes out of nowhere and you don't expect it. Following it is one of the most brutal cutscenes in the game too. It's very impactful, and I'm glad it wasn't overused, as it so easily could have been. That's three Harry Masons. Story. In 1898, Koudelka is psychically drawn to Nemeton Mansion and finds it overrun with monsters. Upon meeting the caretakers who tried to poison her and her friend Edward, they realise they must stay and discover more about the place. As the story progresses, there's a lot of disturbing realizations, and in classic gothic horror style, a lot of tragedy and loss, which makes for some of the more emotive scenes. There's a load of interesting notes and letters laying around that are really kind of sad to read. The story starts off slow, but really gets interesting around the second disc of the game, and by the end of it was totally enthralling, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst I wasn't convinced turn-based combat could allow a game to be frightening, I was mostly proven wrong. It's a creepy, unique game with some really interesting storytelling. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, so if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was creeped out by some of the monsters, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Witch Hunt is a first-person open-world horror game set in the 1700s where you're tasked with hunting down dangerous mythical beings. Atmosphere. Whilst the town is eerily quiet, the forest feels intimidating. The map is very large and it's easy to get lost and disorientated. The draw distance and thickness of the trees make it very easy for you to get ambushed by enemies that roam through them. It gives off a feeling that you're somewhere that you shouldn't be. You really don't know what any of the enemies are capable of until you engage with them, or even what's out there. There's a lot of mysterious and supernatural things that roam about the wilderness, and yet again none of it is explained to you, making every interaction feel like you're dabbling in things you don't understand. The sound of a heartbeat plays when your target is in the area, and it has the ability to put you on edge immediately. To even the odds, you have the ability to see through the beast's eyes for a brief moment, which you'll spend trying to figure out where it is and if it can see you. It makes sense. The feeling I felt most during the game was fear of the unknown and apprehension for what lies ahead. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Encountering each enemy is pretty frightening. Most enemies hit hard and don't go down easily. The gun takes a long time to reload and you'll be mauled to death before you can reload it. If you can't think quick enough, you'll die. This goes for most of the other enemies you'll come across. Meeting the beast or the witch is usually a frantic encounter, trying to deal enough damage to it before it kills you. There's a lot of enemies that use jump scares and ominous sounds like the whispering shadows that make a beeline for you the second you get too close, flashing up faces on the screen and draining your magic power. While some scares are cheaper than others, the combat in itself, which is a large majority of the game, can be totally nerve-wracking and brutal. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. There's some very light ambience, it's almost indistinguishable from the sound of wind. Part of me thinks it's a bit too subtle, but it does work well enough to give the game a creepy, eerie feel. The monsters make all their own, easily identifiable sounds so you can tell when they're in the area, and I really like a lot of the sound effects for the whispering shadows and most of the unnatural events. There's random whispering in places which often cause me to stop in my tracks and listen. The voice acting is a bit cheesy, but it's so rare that it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of good stuff here. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Whilst blood spurts out of monsters when you shoot them, the level of light doesn't make it very noticeable amongst the grey and brown of the trees. You don't really encounter anything gory very often, which I think is okay. Whatever you do encounter could have been more impactful by having some more disturbing scenes than what's available. That's still 3 Harry Masons. Story. There's not a lot of explanation for what's taking place. Your backstory is just some text at the start that states monsters attacked your family when you were younger and you devoted your life to slaying beasts. You heard the town of Belleville is under threat and you turn up to defeat it. It's a bit of a shame there's not much context for things during the gameplay. There's a few bits of environmental storytelling, but it's a bit ambiguous. It would be nice to have some genuine backstory. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the early game is a lot more frightening than the later game once you learn how the enemies work, it never really stops being creepy. I'd say the biggest downfall of the game is also one of its strengths. Whilst the map is very large and makes exploration a lot of fun, it also makes tracking down the beast who's always moving a difficult challenge. Even with the beast sight, if it isn't anywhere recognisable, then you've wasted your time and you'll be meandering for a while. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share his opinion, that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I covered with fear the first time the beast proximity alarm sounded, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. You can also go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Grey is a mod for Half-Life 2 where you travel through dark and twisted environments, slowly descending into madness. Atmosphere. Grey has some of the most creative environments I've ever seen, with abstract and nightmarish landscapes twisting and morphing into each other. It displays dreamlike consistency with doors that seemingly transport you to other realms of decay and dereliction, but even the more terrestrial areas are the kind of run-down urban places you don't want to find yourself in at night. Its visuals are fascinating. Faces lurch out of the environment and scream at you with black cobwebs obscuring the darkened path ahead. It's some really awesome stuff that someone has put a lot of time into. Some areas feel vaguely repulsive, some feel kind of dreamlike, and others reflect the cold loneliness of empty urban areas. But despite all this, it feels very static, and a lot of it kind of fell flat. Despite all the creativity, the atmosphere of the game is a bit lifeless. I didn't feel tension or apprehension at all, and for at least the first 20 minutes I didn't even feel anything eerie. The creators chose not to include any enemies for roughly half the game, which leaves you with nothing to worry about for roughly half the game. Grey isn't threatening for such a long time, and at its best it just ends up seeming weird, bewildering, and sort of unpleasant. No Harry Masons.
Mom?
Scares. Whilst there's a lot of creepy moments, most of them were just things flashing in and out of existence, and most of the time I didn't even stop to look at them. The landscape changes so frequently you get desensitized to it, and the only thing that really stood out was the combat. The combat took me right back to Cry of Fear. Grey's most frightening elements were the enemies themselves, which all appeared out of the darkness and charged at you screaming. The frantic shooting combat was pretty intense, and even if it didn't have the same variety as Cry of Fear. There are a lot of repeated enemies throughout the game. Some of them were extremely annoying with their attack patterns. They were very hard to hit, and in dark rooms it was difficult to see where you were being attacked from. I seemed to spend a lot of the game on low health, which made nearly every hit a killing blow, which was intense but also frustrating. The scary moments come purely from the combat and the anticipation of yet more jump scare enemies, but it is hard to say it isn't effective. That's one Harry Mason. Sound design. I personally found it a bit distracting that some of the Half-Life 2 sound effects were still in place here, and one or two of the monsters even used variations of the zombies' wails from Half-Life 2 as well. It dragged me out of the game and reminded me I was playing a Half-Life 2 mod. But on the other hand, bumping into objects in dark corridors made a noise that startled me a few times too. The music reminded me of a less impactful Silent Hill soundtrack, as it lacks a lot of the raw emotion you get from them, but there are still lots of creepy pieces. The voice acting for the player character, Grey, was done by the same guy who voiced Simon from Cry of Fear. It's far from the best performance ever, and some of the lines that expressed shock felt very forced. There were some cool whispering effects, the guns sounded punchy, and the 3D audio was decent but sometimes a little glitchy. Overall it could be better, but everything serves its purpose. That's 2 Harry Masons.
What the hell? Through block 12? Who's fucked up enough to leave bloody notes all over the place?
Gore. Blood spurts out of enemies when you attack them. There were walls plastered in blood, notes written in blood, and various pools of it around the place. It harkens back to Silent Hill, with blood and rusty metal being a recurring thing in the visual style, and the most jarring scene sees the main character use a power drill to repeatedly perforate a mangled child's corpse. Even if it serves a story purpose, it felt needless and excessive. That's still 2 Harry Masons. Story. Whilst the story, to begin with, involves investigating everyone's disappearance, it evolves into following Grey's mother's ghost and finding out about your father, and recalling the events in your frankly overbearingly depressing past. Grey's history seems like the saddest backstory anyone could realistically have had, and the concept of the game's plot being his slow descent into insanity is something many games have tried in the past, and it's pretty unclear how or why it's happening here. There's some notes floating around, and the loading screens had a paragraph or so explaining what was going on in the mind of Grey, but it was mostly the same thing about how he didn't know what was happening, and I suspect that he wasn't cut out to understand it. Only by checking the wiki did events of the game become slightly clearer, and whilst a lot of the game's events were probably meant to be abstract symbolism of a damaged psyche, it's still difficult to understand, or maybe I'm just overthinking it. Making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. Grey is visually impressive, but it missed the mark for me. I didn't find its atmosphere compelling, the gore was over the top even when the backstory was factored into it, and overall it doesn't provide anything deeper than a few jump scares in a series of dark rooms. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was startled many times by brushing past boxes, I did not scream like a banshee or run away with the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Resident Evil 3 returns in a new remake where Jill Valentine is back again to be terrorized by the bioweapon Nemesis.
Maybe I can hit the full tank.
Atmosphere. As opposed to the original game, the Resident Evil 3 remake takes place near the start of the outbreak in Raccoon City and precedes the events of Resident Evil 2, which has changed a lot of things, but impacted the atmosphere the most. The town is still alive with people at the start, and you don't go for very long without engaging with Carlos or someone else, and there's not really a feeling of being truly alone. The feeling of returning to the Raccoon City Police Department and seeing the chaos left by Leon and Claire's desperate escape isn't here, as it hasn't happened, which makes that part of the game just dull. The remake has a much higher emphasis on combat sections, including a defend the room part with Carlos that felt completely out of place. It's fun to be able to play as him, but he can literally punch zombies over, and whilst it's cool to see, it makes the zombies feel even more redundant. Raccoon City doesn't feel dead, the familiar music plays, but its feeling of hopelessness and desolation just isn't there. What's most disappointing is just there isn't really anything to replace it. Even when left alone for the brief moments in the game, I didn't really feel any atmosphere whatsoever. There's no eerie quiet of a town claimed by zombies. There's nothing. No Harry Masons.
It's my turn, bitch.
Scares. We all know that Nemesis is the main attraction to this entry in the series, and it's a big letdown on that front too. Most of the interactions with him turn into boss battles and combat sections where he plays a large ugly bullet sponge, and even when you're being chased through the streets by him, he's rendered useless by so many embarrassing things. In the original game, it was terrifying when he followed you through the door loading screens, because up until that point, nothing else had been able to do that. But now the loading screens are gone, he just sometimes stops chasing you when you enter a save room, or waits outside for you when you enter an area he can't go into, and it's almost comedic. Just like the Resident Evil 2 remake, the heightened maneuverability and Jill's dodge mechanic made the combat very easy, and most of the zombies unremarkable. And whilst the pale head ones, which are disgusting in appearance, boast the ability to regenerate, a shotgun blast to the head seemed to put them down permanently, at least on standard difficulty. The hunter was difficult to kill but could be punched down by Carlos and didn't feel like a huge threat either. The only thing to worry about was getting stuck in a chain of being bitten and knocked down, which was more frustrating than anything. Sadly, for me at least, there wasn't really anything frightening in the game. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. Whilst it's missing a lot of the haunting zombie tracks and that eerie wind that made the town feel so dead and empty, it's got some good pieces, though most of the music is action tracks to go with the various combat sections. There's a nice inclusion of some of the original music, but it was the most memorable part of the soundtrack. The sound effects were all pretty good, the voice acting was all very good, and they managed to get a decent rendition of Nemesis's only line. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. Blowing up zombies' heads is still incredibly satisfying and the gore is still quite high quality, but it's missing a lot of the more iconic scenes from the original. Nemesis's transformation is a lot wilder in this, and thanks to the graphics it's a lot more detailed too, which is pretty nice. The pale heads, as mentioned earlier, are totally disgusting looking, and shooting them clearly does not improve their look. Whilst it's missing things that would have been nice to see in modern day graphics, what is here is pretty good. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. Jill Valentine is the last member of the STARS unit left in Raccoon City and the target of the Umbrella-made bioweapon Nemesis. It's revealed later in the game that the town is going to be destroyed with missiles to prevent further spreading of the T-virus outbreak which caused the zombies. The story has been changed radically from the original, and in my opinion this is the worst move they made when redesigning the remake. Large chunks of the game have been cut out completely, bosses were removed, memorable scenes don't take place anymore, and most of the game is a very rushed take on the story, cutting a lot of corners and adding things that were of no interest. As a result, it's short and forgettable, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the Resident Evil 2 remake wasn't perfect, they nailed it a lot better than they did this. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was tired of fighting Nemesis, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. OK Normal is a retro-style horror experience based on PlayStation 1 platforming games. Atmosphere. The game recreates the feeling of a bizarre, low-budget PlayStation 1 platformer excellently, from the texture warping to the colour bleeding where it emulates a CRT television. Its visuals are particularly trippy, with checkerboard floors and mysterious geometric shapes that hang in the air or spin on an axis for no real reason. The music plays hypnotic synth pieces that bounce around in your headphones. Whilst the gameplay is simply to collect a few items and find the goal, this becomes a monotonous task that's so simple-minded it lets you soak in the atmosphere all the more, and really take in how weird the environment you're in is. It descends quite rapidly into dread-filled levels with darkened screens, and everything swirls around you as the music is replaced with low rumbling and the crying of a baby. Boxes filled with eyes spin around, and the floating cloud companion starts asking what's happened and then berates you. The levels turn into abstract moving mazes that feel impossible to navigate, and you start feeling a sense of despair. It touches directly to the emotions by sound and visuals alone. It's very weird and evokes a lot of feelings of dread and confusion. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There's only one jump scare and it's a sudden cut that's executed brilliantly, considering it's the only thing like it in the game. Some of the things that Cloud says that are supposed to be ominous didn't really have that effect on me whatsoever and kind of fell flat. There are a few enemies in the game, from the giant floating skull to something that resembles a sea mine or a biological virus, but they're not really threatening and it was more annoying to bump into them than it was scary. They don't feel sentient and just seem to be going through the motions. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. There's a lot of different tracks, from the hypnotic pieces to the first level to the creepy reverb-soaked nothingness of the later levels. The music goes a long way into making the environments feel as creepy as they do. The sound effects are all fittingly 90s, with some of them feeling they were taken right out of Atari classics. Some of the more menacing sound effects resembled backwards moaning and are pretty creepy. The sound effect that plays with each line of dialogue from the talking Cloud varies in pitch and seems both cheerful and menacing at the same time. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There isn't any, and there didn't seem to be the need for any. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The game is more of a horror experience and contains no real story. I don't think the game would have benefited by a backstory either. The final score, 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. OK Normal is a really interesting game that is surprisingly effective at providing weird feelings and emotions. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I found the game unnaturally weird, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished. If none of us make it, at least there'll be some kind of a record. The storm's been hitting us pretty hard now for 48 hours. We still have nothing to go on. One other thing. I think it rips through your clothes when it takes you over. We're all very tired. There's nothing else I can do. Just wait. R.J. McCready, helicopter pilot, U.S. Outpost North 31.
The Thing is a video game adaptation of the 1982 John Carpenter classic of the same name. It follows the story of Captain Blake, who was sent to investigate the camp after the events of the film. Atmosphere. The game starts off very strong, allowing you to explore the charred remains of the US base from the movie as a bit of fan service. The blizzard is still thick and the ominous alien spaceship is waiting below. But soon after, the game's atmosphere kind of dissipates. There's no soundtrack to speak of besides specific moments, and the silence isn't eerie because it's mostly filled with gunfire. Shooting and burning enemies is a large portion of the game. The environments are a bit generic and repetitive to explore anyway. There's no tension even when one of your teammates turns out to be infected. You just kill them and move on with the game. That's no Harry Mason.
Got the kid? Good. The report said the hypo contains a chemical that reacts with blood. Do it. We'll soon know, one way or another.
Now I'm gonna show you what I already know.
Area looks secure. Maybe you will get us out of this.
Scares. The game's biggest selling point is its biggest failure. Having AI squad mates that could potentially be alien clones sounds like a good idea on paper, but it's horribly executed, with most of the NPCs being so generic and disposable that it doesn't really matter who is a copy and who isn't. When one of them turns out to be a copy and transforms, it's cool the first time, but after that happens so often that it's really nothing special. The game assigns them names and they all have similar voices and say the same lines over and over. Sometimes there's almost a sense of camaraderie with them when they get you through difficult sections, but many of them die in cutscenes or are slain by the massive number of aliens you encounter, and then 5 minutes later you get some more AI buddies. The alien designs are kinda cool, but it feels like they could have been a bit more varied in design. There's a raw, nasty look to the texture work on them, but the AI makes them run around in a blind panic and they don't seem to be a huge threat. There's plenty of random jump scares with smaller creatures bursting out of vents or climbing in through the windows, and scripted events where things just blow up for no reason to scare the player. The boss battles go on for way too long considering the amount of damage you deal, and it feels like the health bar is almost useless since it takes only a few shots to put an enemy into the red, and then another 40 shots and multiple attempts at burning it to put it down. Whilst there's some decent stuff here, it doesn't deliver on the one thing most people would play the game for. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The music only comes in when something happens, and as quickly it goes. It's a real disappointment. If the thudding synth of the John Carpenter soundtrack had been prominent in certain areas, it could have certainly enhanced the atmosphere. The sound effects of the guns are very generic, but pretty satisfying. As mentioned earlier, the AI companions talk a lot and often reveal where there's an enemy before you even see them. They tell you all the time when they're upset or scared or want a gun, and many times it just made me wish I was doing the section on my own. The enemies scream and make similar noises to the ones in the film, but not the howling bellows from the more iconic scenes, which is a missed opportunity to instill dread. That's still no Harry Masons. Gore. Blood sprays all over the place and dead enemies lie in pools of blood that slowly sink into the ground as they dissolve. It's pretty cool. It's bright red and stands out a lot too. Lots of rooms are plastered in grisly red matter and ripped apart bodies that just look gnarly thanks to the graphics. Also, setting enemies on fire is incredibly cool and satisfying. That's one Harry Mason. Story. The game picks up where the movie left off and has you exploring the remains of the base and finding out what happened. There's no sign of MacReady or Childs, but the alien menace certainly did not perish in the cold. After the opening, the game's story declines into doing basic military-style missions and chasing dead ends. The game has a lot of cliché moments that aren't very impactful, killing off characters 5 minutes after meeting them, and making the bad guy so unambiguously the bad guy that it's kind of ridiculous. There's loads of jarring moments like this point where my 2 comrades were slain in an explosion as I boarded an elevator, and then after a loading screen I'm dumped out into the Arctic snow with no clue of how I got there. Characters come and go so quickly that there's no surprise when people turn out to be copies, and even when they aren't copies, they die anyway. Making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. This game had such a good premise. The idea of AI companions that follow you through the game that could turn out to be copies would have been fantastic. In my head I imagined something like Until Dawn with characters you grew to like and had unique personalities, but what I got instead is a gory run and gun game set on an Arctic base with characters who are killed off as quickly as you meet them. Don't get me wrong though, this game is extremely fun. I'd still recommend this if you like shooting games, but it's not a good horror game. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I was almost in tears of laughter at the odd behaviour of the AI, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. You can always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Resident Evil is a 1996 survival horror game and really needs no introduction. Trapped in a zombie-infested mansion in the S.T.A.L.K.E.R mountains, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine discover the secrets that lie within. Welcome to the world of survival horror. Atmosphere. An eerie silence hangs over the mansion, and its pristine condition but lack of people is mildly unsettling. In the Great Hall there's a relentless tick of a clock, and zombies shuffle around the winding corridors and lurk behind the numerous locked doors. Rooms contain strange and complex puzzles, and secret areas await behind bookcases. All the while outside, the zombie dogs wait to rip you to shreds. There's a grandiose feeling to the game with its large staircases and ornately furnished rooms, but then there's the gardens and outbuildings that have been taken over by evil plants and other failed experiments. After the opening sequences, you're left alone for the majority of the game, and there's a great feeling of isolation as you play, with only few parts where you interact with other members of the STARS unit. Thanks to the door loading screens, there's tension for what lies in the next room, and the soundtrack manages to evoke feelings of sinister unease with its creepy 90s strings. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. To this day, I argue the scariest part of Resident Evil are the tank controls that leave you feeling vulnerable and at a disadvantage to the zombies and hopelessly outclassed by the hunters. All the jump scares, the zombie dogs jumping through windows, the snakes falling from above, and even the giant snake in the attic just aren't as frightening as not being able to get away in time from an enemy, or panicking whilst running and catching a wall, slowing yourself down, or just watching your body fall lifelessly onto the floor as a hunter leaps past you, taking your head clean off as it bounds past. There's the failure state of some puzzles that can cause you to panic too, like the room that fills up with gas when you activate the panel, or the room with the crushing ceiling that you swear is going to be your demise. And it's all scary because of the save system. Limited saves means if you didn't save, you're going to have to go and do a lot of it again, but this time you'll have to do better. I still find this the most difficult Resident Evil game, and I think that's a good thing, because with no consequences of failure, there's nothing to worry about. There are a few things that betray the serious tone of the game, like the silly voice acting and some of the CGI cutscenes where you see a hunter tear through a corridor and then politely open a door instead of smashing through it. Really, it's not these moments that you'll remember the most though. It's the running out of ammo or herbs and resorting to using a knife to make it through the nerve-wracking journey back to the save room. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music in the game is very memorable, with some really simple but creepy pieces. The iconic 90s strings always reminded me of something from the X-Files, and there are some really creepy synthesizer pieces that play unsettling tones, and of course the save room music that's still vaguely uneasy. The dialogue is of course terrible, with B-movie quality voice acting that's so hilariously bad that it never fails to get a chuckle out of me, but it's become part of the charm of playing the game, and it's at its silliest here. The sound effects have become trademark of the game now, and everything from the sound of a zombie groaning to the creaking of the doors as they open is totally unforgettable. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The pixelated gore never really gets old. Blowing up zombie heads and watching blood seep out from underneath their bodies as they twitch on the floor is still really cool to see even all these years later. It's pretty tame from what the series would lead on to, but it fits this game perfectly. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. After trying to find out what happened to the STARS Alpha team, the Bravo team arrive in the forest outside the Spencer mansion and are chased inside by zombie dogs. Once inside, they split up and try to find survivors, but instead, they find the living dead. The story is sometimes really creepy, with some diary entries being almost disturbing, and sometimes cheesy with yet more cliches of scientific experiments gone wrong. But it runs with all of it, and as the mansion opens up, you'll discover what's below, as well as characters' true motives. It's a huge plot twist for the first-time player, making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. It's hard to understate what Resident Evil did for horror games. Whilst it wasn't the first, it refined a lot of things from what came before it and led to so many others to give survival horror a go, leading on to some of the greatest games of all time. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I'm lucky not to be a Jill sandwich, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.